So if an experiment is properly designed and properly performed, and therefore it is able to fulfill all three criteria of causality, we will say that this experiment is able to establish internal validity. And by internal validity, or the extent to which this experiment is internally valid, we mean the extent to which the claim of causality is warranted, right? Or the extent to which you can confidently claim that you are establishing what you try to establish, right? The causal relationship between, for example, time spent studying and GPA, or interpersonal warmth causing different perceptions of a person's friendliness. Okay, so this is internal validity. Okay, well, by the way, what is external validity? We talk about this concept when we introduced the method of survey. So just to refresh your memory, right? Um, External validity means the extent to which, right, the same results can be generalized. The sample results based on your sample, can be generalized to your target population. That's what we mean when we say an experiment is externally valid. But if when you say the result warrants causality, you'll be saying that the study is internally valid. Okay? All right. Okay, so now after we sort of established the basic ideas of, or basic understanding of experiments, now we can start to talk about different types of experiments. So it turns out there are at least three types of experiments. There are between subject experiments, and under between subject designs, we have single factor between subject designs, and we have multiple factor between subject designs, factorial designs. We have between subject designs, that means we also have within subject designs. And once we combine between and within subject designs, we have mixed factorial designs. That is, as we said, combining between and within subject designs. So, because of time and for the purpose of this introductory class, we will not be talking about within or mixed designs. We'll only be focusing on between subjects designs that have one factor or two factors. Okay? So, in general, a between subject design or between subjects experiment is an experiment in which participants are assessed on the same dependent variable in separate conditions that they are randomly assigned to. In other words, different conditions contain different subjects. Right? More concretely, we create two conditions: warm, cold. Into warm condition, we put, let's say, 5 people. Into cold condition, we put 5 different people, or different 5 people, right? And then we compare if there's any difference between these two conditions. That's why it is called between subjects, right? Between these 5 subjects and these 5 subjects. Okay? So conditions in this sense, we can have a formal definition then, right? Conditions will then be the results, right, of a manipulation. And that is by manipulating an independent variable, we will have at least two conditions, right? We make an independent variable to take one value, and we make the independent variable to take another value. As such, we have two conditions. But if we make an independent variable to take three values, then we'll have three conditions, right? That's what we say conditions, in other words, will be the values that an independent variable will take, or the levels of an independent variable. Okay, so in the previous example, right, the manipulation of interpersonal warmth results in two conditions. That is, a warm condition, a cold condition, right? In other words, the independent variable interpersonal warmth has two values or two levels. The first value, the first value or the first level of warmth is, I should say here actually as warm to make it more accessible, right? Not to use these unnecessary jargons. And a second condition or a second level will be cold. Okay, so as we said repeatedly before, warm is one value that the independent variable warmth will take, and cold will be a second value that the independent variable is made to take. So these are the two values of the independent variables. And now we also sometimes we also say these are two levels of the independent variable. So graphically, right, we can sort of represent this idea as follows. So we create, through manipulation, two conditions, two levels, right? And then we randomly assign some people into this condition, into this condition. And in both conditions, we have participants perceive the target person, results in two scores, right? These people in this condition provide scores which we can compute, with which we can compute an average. And another group of people in this condition, right, will provide scores with which we can compute a second average. And later on, we can compare if there's any difference between the two averages, right, produced from the two conditions. So we'll call this design a one factor between subject design with two conditions. The one factor here is interpersonal warmth, right? And it has two conditions because we make it take two values, warm, cold. It is between subject design because we assign different people into these two groups. In other words, respondent or participants in this condition will never be assigned to this condition, and vice versa, right? Participants in this condition will never be assigned to this condition. The participants in these two different conditions are totally different. So that's why it is between subject design. So that's why we call it a one factor interpersonal warmth. That's the factor, that's the independent variable, which has two conditions in a between subject design. So factor, as we say, right, in the context of experiments, is the same thing as independent variables or IVs. So we can use factors or IVs interchangeably. And of course, as we just said, right, we can, through manipulation, create more than two conditions out of one factor, right? So here we're still dealing with interpersonal warmth, but now we're saying, well, in addition to the two conditions, warm and cold, that we'll create, let's create another level, or let's make the variable, the factor, the independent variable, interpersonal warmth, take a third value, and we'll call it neutral. That is, we neither describe Mike as warm or cold. We simply remove the adjective while keeping all other adjectives and see how people will perceive Mike. So we'll call this the neutral condition, right? So in this case, we call it a one factor because all these three things are the values of the same factor in the personal warmth. It is between subject design because through randomization, different people are assigned to different conditions. And later on, we'll compare the differences between these participants who are assigned to these different conditions. And we have three conditions. So one factor in the personal warmth. Between subject design, different people are being assigned to different conditions, and they're compared against each other with one, two, three conditions. So just as a reminder, factor is the same thing as in the personal independent variable. We have one independent variable here with three conditions. That's why we call it a one factor design with three conditions. Right? So just to reinforce our understanding or memory, conditions equal to the levels of the IV with three levels, three conditions. In this case, this independent variable or factor in the personal warmth take three values: warm, neutral, cold. Okay. So with a single factor or one factor between subject design with two conditions, this is how we sort of tally the results, right? So we have our dependent variable here. So again, let me change the jargon used here from probability assessment to perception, right? Perception. So as we say, right, we will assign different people into these two conditions, which are the two values that the factor in the personal warmth would take. Let's say, we assign the first 10 participants into the warm condition, and on a 7-point scale, they indicate how friendly Mike is, with 7 being very friendly, 1 being not friendly. Okay, not 7 means very friendly. So as we expect, people are assigned to the warm condition, they score higher on the scale, meaning they're more likely to perceive Mike as warm. In contrast, and expected, people who are assigned, and then we can sort of calculate the averages using all these individual scores, and let's imagine the average is 5.5. Okay, so on average, they believe Mike as kind of warm, not very, but kind of warm, right? Higher than the midpoint 4. In contrast, the next 10 participants assigned to the cold condition also are provided with a scale, and expected because Mike is described as cold, they perceive Mike as less friendly. So their scores are sort of clustered toward this end of the scale. And let's imagine that they have an average of 3.5. So on average, these people, right, perceive Mike as not very friendly. And then we can easily plot the result. So again, I will change the name to, it's not anchor size, but person perception, person description, or, interpersonal warmth, right? Interpersonal warmth, okay? And then the y-axis represents how friendly people perceive Mike is. And we know that people in the warm condition, right, they perceive Mike as pretty friendly compared to participants in the cold condition. Right, this bar is higher than this bar if we make the graph better, we'll see some, reading here that says, this 5.5, the 3.5 in general, or in average, people who believe that Mike is warm perceive Mike as more friendly than people who believe Mike is cold. Okay, so this result will sort of suggest that our experiment is successful. And in general, we'll call an experiment successful if the manipulation, here the manipulation of cold, warm, the manipulation of interpersonal warmth, produces the difference in the intended direction across the two conditions. We have two conditions here, and as expected, right, we observe that people in this condition have higher scores on perceived friendliness of Mike than participants in this condition. That is, the difference in the intended direction between these two conditions. And then we can conclude, this experiment is successful. The manipulation of interpersonal warmth works. Okay? So, in other words, the essence of analyzing experiment is to compare averages or means, right? Averages, means across different conditions. And that's especially true for between subjects experiments. Okay? Okay, so far we've discussed experiments which only has one independent variable. For example, interpersonal warmth, right? We can, through manipulation, create multiple conditions. We can create multiple conditions from this one or single independent variable. We can have two, we can have three, we can have four, and five, doesn't matter. Okay? But now the question is, we can create multiple conditions from one factor or from one independent variable. But now the question is, what if we have more than one factors? We have multiple independent variables, and from each independent variable, we can create multiple conditions. How do we analyze experiments like that? Multiple IVs, multiple conditions under each IVs. What do we do with those experiments? All right, so that will be the content for our next class. All right, so see you tomorrow.